One thing I've often regretted about my channel, and have voiced in the past, is how few RPGs I cover. I love role-playing games, and I fell in love with them when I first played Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo. I'd always hoped to cover more on my channel, but the problem I always have is trying to squeeze time in to play and record them and still keep a consistent release schedule. I mean, I haven't been consistent in years, but I still had the same hang-up regardless. I have a good chunk of games like this sitting on my shelf ranging from NES to PS2 titles that I would love to cover, but just keep avoid even playing them and enjoying them due to time constraints. So with my recent renewed vigor for my YouTube channel, I said, fuck it, this time I'm actually going to cover some RPGs because I really want to. So I recorded a bunch of shorter games, did reviews for shorter games, and then gave myself ample time to play through a longer RPG like Lufia 2. And damn it, I'm glad I did, because I fell in love with this game all over again. I haven't played Lufia 2 since like 2002 on emulation. A good friend of mine owned this game, and I had played it a little bit because it was his copy. I never really got to borrow it. But I did play it a little bit after that on emulation, like I said, and played it through to completion. But this was like 20 years ago. Jeez. Like, I keep making age jokes in my videos lately, because it's just crazy how quick time flies. But man, 20 years? It's been 20 years since I played this game. So yeah, that's why the game felt so new to me. Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals is a JRPG for the Super Nintendo released early in 1995 in Japan and later in 1996 in North America. The game was developed by Neverland and published by Natsume here in the West. Interestingly enough, despite the 2 in the title, this game is a prequel to the original game, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. You take the role of Maxim, a monster hunter who grew up in the village of Elcid. He's the town's defender and works closely with his childhood friend Tia, who has a giant unrequited crush on him. After the village elder shows Maxim his secret dungeon, and it's not as bad as it sounds, trust me, it's like a tutorial for the game. A townsperson shows up stating that monsters have taken over the cave that connects to the neighboring town, and Maxim leaves to handle the situation. Maxim defeats the lizard man who is leading the monsters and is met by a mysterious woman named Iris, who tells him that it's his destiny to travel, meet fellow warriors, and fight to save the world. You'll travel the world, meet lots of people, friends and foes alike, solve local issues, to further your own goals of stopping the evil Sinistrals, super beings who are bent on destroying the human race and controlling the lands for themselves. The thing is, if you have already played the first game in the series, you already know what happens. Maxim meets up with Guy, Salan, and Artia to take on the Sinistrals at the Fortress of Doom atop a floating island in the sky. About halfway through the game, Maxim and Salan get married and have a kid. Again, this isn't really spoiler territory because the developers intended you to already know this. The story is pretty basic, but it's actually translated fairly well and has some good laugh-out-loud moments throughout. Though some of these enemy translations are not great, and some are a little laugh-worthy. While it may not be the main draw of the game, the story is certainly a high point and deserves praise for the decent translation compared to other RPGs that were released at the time. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of the story here, so if you want to know more, play the game. The gameplay initially seems like it's pretty standard JRPG fare, consisting of going from town to town, exploring dungeons, and beating up enemies in turn-based combat. Really, the combat here is pretty standard stuff. You choose your tactics before each turn starts, and enemies and allies take their turn based on their agility stat. The higher the stat, the higher that character's turn is in the turn order. Of course, there are magical spells here that most characters can use, which you buy for them in a store rather than them learning spells innately. Spells aren't necessarily essential to combat, but the MP system is pretty generous, and you can usually get through a dungeon and face the boss without running out. MP restoratives are few and far between, so you do have to be a little careful. The nice thing is, a lot of dungeons have these HP and MP restoring tiles before a boss battle, or later in the game, they usually show up halfway through the dungeon. It makes the gameplay pretty forgiving. It's not necessarily super easy, but it's not difficult by any means. Additionally, equipment often has their own special abilities that you can use with IP points, which are gained through taking damage. These abilities range from kinda useless to super helpful. Some deal a good amount of damage and others can heal your party members. Don't forget to take advantage of these because they can make some of the tougher boss battles considerably easier. You can also enlist the help of several monsters that the game calls Capsule Monsters that act as a guest character. They can't be controlled, but they can help beat up enemies or even heal you. I really only used the one that you obtain first, and he seemed like a pretty big help. Sometimes he'd unleash a big attack that would help clear out some enemies for me. Other Capsule Monsters will sometimes run away if they take too much damage or don't really heal you consistently from what I understand. So Fumi is the way to go. There also isn't much to grind in Lufia 2. The only random battles happen on the world map, but the bulk of the gameplay takes place in dungeons, where to enter a battle you actually have to touch an enemy to engage. This is great because if you take your time to kill most of the enemies in each dungeon, you'll always be at a good level to proceed through the game. And if you ever do feel behind, there are a few of these colored core enemies in different areas of the world map that drop big amounts of experience points to help you catch up. Again, Lufia 2 is a very forgiving game. The highlight of Rise of the Sinistrals isn't the combat or story, however, it's the way dungeons are designed. Dungeons in this game aren't just straightforward exploration endeavors. There are puzzles in each dungeon that you need to figure out to proceed through or to find hidden items. Some puzzles are very easy to figure out and others can be real brain teasers. I'm not a super patient person, so in some cases I just looked up the solutions on the RPG Shrine website, a website that if you like 16-bit RPGs, you probably know. This place has been around for longer than some of you have been alive, and I am not kidding. Anyway, the puzzles really add a lot to Lufia 2 and really set it apart from other games in the genre. They range from picking up pots to lay on switches to trigger doors, moving enemies around so they'll trigger switches for you, to using a slew of Zelda-like items to solve tricky situations. You can swing your sword to slash down vines and grass, shoot an arrow that can trigger switches or stun enemies, set a bomb that can blow holes in some walls, a hookshot that will let you cross gaps and chasms, a hammer that can break blocks and move movable blocks from a distance, and a fire arrow that can burn grass and bushes. You'll obtain items as you go through the game, and you don't start with all of them, so it does a good job of introducing new situations without piling it all on right at the start. Lufia 2 is a good-looking game, but it's not the best-looking game on the system or even in the genre. It's got a lot of great, colorful, and charming sprites and backgrounds, though. Everything is vibrant, and I really like that. I honestly love the character sprites, especially in battle and in the menu screen. They're nice and detailed in that SD or super deformed anime way, and fit the tone of the game really well. The walking animation, though, is really weird. They just kind of jiggle. And I always kind of laugh at the enemy attack animations. They just flip-flop the sprite back and forth. It works for the game, though. It looks silly, but it fits in. And the music is so good. The melodies are super catchy, and the accompanying instruments do a great job to enhance the tunes. The battle themes, and especially the boss battle theme, are incredible. This stuff is right up there with the best of the best on the SNES, and even some of the best in gaming in general. I can't praise the game enough for that. Even some of the slower cutscene tunes are really good and moving as well. I love this soundtrack, and if you're a fan of game music, you will too if you haven't already heard it. One thing I usually have a problem when going back to older JRPGs is just how slow they feel. This isn't a problem with Lufia 2. You're fighting enemies on your terms most of the time, though sometimes those enemies will outmaneuver you and box you in if you aren't careful. But you aren't really beholden to extensive random battles like in other games. Battles run fairly quickly too, so it's not like you're going to be stuck in a ton of long, drawn-out fights with basic enemies. And to top it off, Maxim full-on sprints everywhere. Instead of including a sprint button in this game, it's like Neverland just decided to instead make the sprint option a default and not include a slower walk. This makes Lufia 2 so much easier to sit down and play, in my opinion. Though sometimes you'll overshoot doors or stairs because you're moving so fast. It's a small price to pay though. The game cuts a quick pace, and that's awesome. The game only took me about 20 hours to beat, and that was with breaks while leaving the SNES on. I like RPGs that don't force you to spend a month of your life working through it. There is one big problem with Lufia 2 though, and thankfully it's not game-breaking, but it's pretty bad. There is a whole area that is completely glitched in the NTSC version. Unfortunately, I didn't get actual game capture footage of it because by that point in the game, I was so tired of recording, I just put it on my big TV so I could go relax downstairs and play the rest of the game because I figured I had enough footage. But I did go ahead and capture some with my phone, so this is what you're going to see. Unfortunately, the only way to play Lufia 2 is on the SNES itself, or through emulation. There hasn't been a re-release on any eShops or modern consoles yet. However, there is a remake for the Nintendo DS that I fully intend on picking up and playing soon. The DS game also hasn't been re-released as far as I'm aware, but I am excited to check it out. Apparently it's more of an action RPG and just reimagines the story, but yeah, looks cool. If you want the SNES cart, it's going to set you back a lot of cash. I picked it up several years ago for like $70, which at the time I thought was probably too much to pay for it, but seeing that it's going damn near $150 these days, I'm okay with the amount I spent now. That being said, it's definitely worth it to play Lufia 2. If you're a fan of JRPGs, play it. Even if you're not a fan of retro games in general, it's still a good JRPG to play. I highly recommend Lufia 2, and it's become one of my favorites on the system. Thanks for watching, guys. Later.